I was sitting at the dinner table in the formal dining room of their $4.2 million home in the Pacific Palisades, wearing a suit that cost more than my entire monthly rent used to, surrounded by Eleanor and her husband Charles and their friends from the country club, all of whom were looking at me like I was a stain on their expensive tablecloth. My wife Sophie, who I had loved since the moment I met her at Stanford 14 years ago, was looking at her mother with an expression that suggested she was calculating exactly how much of her inheritance it would be worth to cut off contact with this woman forever. How had we gotten here? How had I, a man who had just revolutionized the entire renewable energy sector with a patent so elegant and efficient that it had taken the top engineers at Apple 3 years to understand the mathematics behind it, allowed myself to be sitting across from a woman who was so insecure about her own irrelevance that she had to demean my work to feel good about herself? My name is Gabriel Torres, and this is the story of how I learned that validation from the people you love matters far less than the validation you give yourself, and that sometimes the universe has a beautiful sense of timing when it comes to teaching people humility. I grew up in East Los Angeles in a working-class neighborhood. My father was a mechanic. My mother was a seamstress. They were hardworking people who believed in education as the great equalizer, and they had pushed all 4 of their children toward academics and achievement. My older sister Lucia was now a doctor. My older brother Miguel was a lawyer. My younger brother Diego was an engineer for Boeing. And I was the artist of the family, the one who spent his time in the garage building things, tinkering with concepts, trying to solve problems that nobody had asked me to solve. When I was 12, I built a water filtration system out of PVC pipes and sand and charcoal that could clean even heavily contaminated water. When I was 16, I designed a solar panel array that was 30% more efficient than anything on the market at the time. When I was 19, I had my first patent, a system for capturing and storing solar energy that was revolutionary in its simplicity. My parents were proud. My siblings were proud. And I knew, with the kind of certainty that only a teenager can have, that I was going to change the world. I went to Stanford on a full scholarship. I majored in engineering with a minor in physics. And it was there, in the library on a Tuesday afternoon in 2009, that I met Sophie Whitmore. She was studying for her MBA. I was working on what would become the foundational concept for my most important patent. We were both reaching for the same book on renewable energy systems, and we literally collided in front of the shelves. She laughed. I laughed. And somehow, over the next hour, we ended up sitting at a coffee shop talking about everything. Our families, our dreams, our fears, our visions for what we wanted to do with our lives. Sophie was everything I had never known I wanted. She was brilliant and kind and ambitious, but not in a ruthless way. In a way that came from genuine passion for making a difference. She came from money, but she didn't act like it. She was unpretentious and thoughtful, and completely unconcerned with the kind of social status that seemed to matter so much to so many people. When I met her parents for the first time, 6 months into our relationship, I had been nervous. I knew what they would see: a kid from East LA whose father fixed cars for a living, whose mother sewed clothes for other people, who lived in a neighborhood where there were more liquor stores than libraries. I knew they would see someone who was not good enough. I was right. Eleanor had looked me up and down when I shook her hand. She had asked what my father did, and when I told her, I saw something flicker across her face. A kind of barely concealed disappointment that her daughter had gotten involved with someone whose family didn't have the right kind of background. Charles had been slightly more polite, but only slightly. He had asked about my career prospects, and when I had explained that I was still in school, working on my engineering degree while pursuing some patent applications on the side, he had done that particular kind of smile that wealthy people do when they're trying not to be overtly condescending. "That's very entrepreneurial of you," he had said, in a tone that suggested he didn't actually think it was entrepreneurial so much as quixotic and impractical. Over the years, as Sophie and I got more serious, Eleanor's criticism became more pointed. When we got engaged, she had suggested that maybe we should wait until I had established myself professionally before making such a serious commitment. When we got married, she had made a comment at the reception about marrying for love rather than sense, which everyone had laughed at but which I had understood to mean: my daughter married down. When Sophie and I bought a modest house in Pasadena, a small craftsman-style home that we had gotten through an incredible real estate deal because I had spent months negotiating with the seller, Eleanor had visited once and had asked, with genuine confusion, why we hadn't bought something in a nicer neighborhood. What Eleanor didn't understand was that I wasn't trying to impress her. I was too busy trying to change the world. From 2010 to 2022, I had been working on a single problem: how to create a renewable energy storage system that was so efficient, so elegant, and so inexpensive that it could make fossil fuels completely obsolete within a single generation. I had approached it from every angle. I had collaborated with the best minds in the field. I had failed and failed and failed again. Sophie had stood by me through all of it. When I was discouraged, she reminded me why the work mattered. When I was broke because I had invested all my savings into research and development, she went back to work full-time at her consulting job to keep us afloat. When I was frustrated because the technology just wouldn't cooperate with the mathematics, she listened and offered perspective. In early 2022, something clicked. I finally understood the precise configuration of materials and design that would make it all work. I filed for my patent. I hired a patent lawyer named Margaret Chun, an incredible woman who understood both the technology and the business implications of what I had created. For 8 months, we went through the patent approval process. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in September 2022, Margaret called me with news that changed everything. "Gabriel," she said, her voice tight with excitement, "I've been contacted by Apple. Not Apple's patent lawyers. Apple's actual lawyers. The ones who handle their major acquisitions and licensing deals. They want to license your patent. They're prepared to offer $400 million in licensing fees over the next 10 years, plus an additional $50 million upfront for exclusive access to the technology for the first 3 years." I had felt like the ground had shifted underneath me. I had sat down on the kitchen floor because my legs would no longer support my weight. "Are you serious?" I had asked. "Completely serious," Margaret had said. "Gabriel, do you understand what this means? This isn't just money. This is validation. This is proof that what you've been working on all these years matters. This changes everything." I had called Sophie immediately. She had screamed so loud that I thought she had gotten hurt. Then she had cried. And then she had said something that I will remember for the rest of my life. "I never doubted you. Not for a single day. But oh, it's going to be so good to see other people finally understand what I've always known." 2 weeks later, I was in a formal meeting with Apple's executive team. They explained that my technology was going to be incorporated into their renewable energy division, that they wanted to build an entirely new product line around it, that they saw this as the future of energy storage for the next decade. They had prepared a contract that was as close to perfect as a business contract could be. I signed it, and suddenly overnight, I was a man who had just received the first installment of $50 million. I told Sophie before I told anyone else. We sat in our modest Pasadena house, the one her mother had found so disappointing, and we looked at each other and we cried and we laughed and we held each other like we had just won the lottery, which, in a way, we had. Then I called my family. My mother cried. My father said, "Mijo, I always knew. I always knew." My siblings congratulated me with genuine joy, the kind that only comes from people who actually love you. And then Sophie suggested we should tell her parents. "We could invite them to dinner," she had said. "Somewhere nice. Make an evening of it." I had been hesitant. I had told her that I didn't need her parents' validation, that whatever they thought of me had never mattered and would never matter. But Sophie had been insistent. "I want them to see," she had said. "I want them to understand that you were never the problem. Their closed minds were always the problem." So we had arranged a dinner at a high-end restaurant in Los Angeles. Eleanor and Charles had seemed pleased by the invitation, had shown up dressed to the nines, had treated the evening like it was going to be a performance where they could show off their sophisticated daughter and her successful enough husband to the other people in the restaurant. And then Eleanor had said what she had said. We were on the appetizer course when Charles had asked, in that particular tone that suggested he was making conversation but was actually looking for an opportunity to be critical, whether I was still tinkering in my garage or if I had managed to find actual employment. Sophie had stiffened. But before she could respond, Eleanor had leaned back in her chair and had said what I just quoted. "Our daughter deserves better than a tinkerer." And in that moment, my phone had rung. It had been Margaret Chin. And the timing had been so impeccable, so perfectly orchestrated by the universe, that it felt like something out of a movie script. "Gabriel," Margaret had said, "I'm so sorry to call during dinner, but Apple just made the announcement. They went public with a partnership today. Every major news outlet is covering it. You're trending on Twitter. Your patent is being called revolutionary. Congratulations. The world is finally catching up to what you've always known. I had looked at my phone and I had looked at Eleanor, and I had felt something that I had never felt before in her presence. Complete and total indifference to her judgment. Actually, Mrs. Whitmore, I had said, speaking calmly and with genuine courtesy, I'm not a tinkerer. I'm an inventor. My most recent patent just sold to Apple for $400 million in licensing fees. But thank you so much for your concern about whether I'm worthy of your daughter. Fortunately, she's never shared your doubts. Charles had dropped his wine glass. It had shattered on the white tablecloth, staining it red. Eleanor's face had gone completely pale. I'm sorry, what was that about deserving? Charles had asked, his voice cracking slightly. I wasn't talking to you, I had said. And then I had stood up, had taken Sophie's hand, and had walked out of that restaurant. We didn't go home. We went to my parents' house in East Los Angeles. We arrived at 10 p.m. on a Wednesday night, and my mother had opened the door and had taken one look at Sophie's expression and had said, What happened? I had told them the whole story. My mother had laughed so hard she had cried. My father had shaken his head and had said, Some people spend their whole lives looking down on others, and they never notice when the ground beneath them is shifting. Sophie and I left for a month-long vacation the next day. We went to Costa Rica. We sat on a beach, and we talked about what we wanted our life to look like now that the financial pressure was gone. We talked about the house we wanted to build. We talked about the philanthropic foundation we wanted to start, Gabriel's Foundation for Young Innovators in Underserved Communities. We talked about everything except Eleanor and Charles. When we came back, I received an email from Eleanor. It was carefully worded, the kind of apology that wasn't really an apology so much as a strategic attempt at damage control. Dear Gabriel, it began. I hope you and Sophie have been well. I may have spoken hastily at dinner last month. I would very much like the opportunity to discuss our relationship moving forward. Perhaps over lunch. I had shown it to Sophie. She had read it and had looked at me and had asked, What do you want to do? I want to not respond, I had said. I want to build my life with you and your family members who actually value me. I want to use this money to help kids from neighborhoods like mine. And I want to stop giving energy to people who have never wanted anything from me except to feel superior. Sophie had kissed me. I love you, she had said. I know, I had replied. 18 months later, I received an invitation to a gala being held by the American Engineering Society. They were giving me an award for innovation in renewable energy. Eleanor and Charles were apparently being honored as well for their contributions to charitable giving. I went to the gala. I gave a speech about how I had spent most of my life being told that I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't the right kind of person, that I didn't come from the right background. I talked about how I had learned not to internalize those judgments. I talked about how validation that comes from external sources is inherently unstable. It can be taken away at any moment. But validation that comes from doing work you believe in, from loving people who love you back, from knowing in your bones that you have made the world better, that validation is permanent. I looked directly at Eleanor and Charles when I said it. After the speech, Charles approached me. He shook my hand. He said, That was a good speech. And then he said something that surprised me. I owe you an apology. Not because you became successful, but because I judged you unfairly before I ever gave you a chance. That was wrong. It wasn't a grand redemption, but it was something. It was a man finally acknowledging that he had been small-minded. Thank you, I said. I appreciate that. And I meant it. My name is Gabriel Torres. I am 38 years old. I am the founder and CEO of Torres Energy Systems, a company dedicated to making renewable energy accessible to everyone on the planet. I have a wife who never doubted me. I have a foundation that has helped fund the education of over 2,000 young innovators from underserved communities. I have a patent that changed the world. I don't think about Eleanor's words anymore. Not because I've forgiven her, but because they've become irrelevant to my life. She was never my judge. I was always my own judge. And I had already decided that I was enough long before Apple validated what I had always known about myself. What I learned is that the people who try to tear you down are usually the people who are most terrified of their own irrelevance. That judgment from people who don't matter is just noise. And that the greatest victory isn't proving them wrong. It's building a life so meaningful that you stop caring whether they ever acknowledge it. Sophie and I have a daughter now. Her name is Lucia, after Sophie's mother, not Eleanor, but Sophie's biological mother, whom Eleanor had also judged for not being the right kind of person. We are raising Lucia to understand that her worth is not determined by what anyone else thinks of her. That she can be a tinkerer, an inventor, a dreamer, a builder, and none of it will ever require anyone else's permission or approval. Eleanor has been invited to meet Lucia many times. She has shown up occasionally, trying to rebuild a relationship with her grandchild. And I have let her, not for my sake, but for Sophie's. Because Sophie is a generous person, and she believes that people can change. I'm not sure Eleanor has changed, but she has certainly become more polite to me. And that is enough. My name is Gabriel Torres. I was never the problem. Her small mind was always the problem. And I'm grateful every single day that I had the strength to know the difference.